Loretta is 34 years old, and it is 6:45 in the morning in 1957. She is standing in the kitchen of a Buckhead house in Atlanta. The family is not awake yet. The floor is mopped, the coffee is on, and her street shoes are in the paper bag beside the back door. Her white apron is double knotted at the back. She pressed it herself last night. Everything about where she stands and what she carries already says something. By number 1, you will understand exactly what. Number 12, the uniform that wasn't always yours. The white apron was not optional. In many homes across the South, the expectation was specific. A dark dress, a white apron, a white collar, and cuffs. The upkeep belonged to her. The starch in the apron, the scratch of the cap pin against her hair. That was her labor before the labor started. When the domestic workers movement gained momentum in the 1960s, refusing the uniform became one of the first quiet forms of resistance. That tells you everything about what wearing it had meant. The uniform announced the hierarchy before anyone spoke a word. It said who worked here and who was worked for. No introduction needed. Number 11, the name she was never given. She called the 6-year-old Miss Caroline. The 6-year-old called her Loretta. That was the rule. Jim Crow etiquette, documented widely and enforced without a written code, meant that white employers used no courtesy title when addressing black workers. No Mrs., no Miss, first name only. Loretta addressed every adult in that house by title. She addressed the children by title. The exchange was not mutual and was never meant to be. The name rule was not about manners. It was an announcement about rank, made dozens of times a day, every day, in the rooms she kept clean. Loretta's paper bag sits beside the back door. That is not a coincidence. The front door was not hers to use. She came in through the kitchen, left through the kitchen, and changed from her street shoes to her work shoes at the threshold. The back door was the service entrance. The kitchen entry, the place where her presence in the house was acknowledged but categorized. The front door opened onto the world the family showed visitors. The back door opened onto the world that made that possible. It was not a door. It was a diagram of the whole arrangement. Number 9, the bathroom she could not use. She cleaned the family bathroom. She scrubbed the tile, polished the chrome, but was not permitted to use it. In many households, a separate toilet, sometimes in the basement, sometimes a different facility entirely, was designated for the domestic worker. The image of a domestic worker using a separate bathroom should carry the same symbolic weight as a segregated lunch counter. The labor and the rules did not have to be consistent. She cleaned the room. The room was not hers. Those two facts lived together every day. Number 8, the separate plate. She cooked the meals. She did not eat them at the family table. Workers in many households ate separately, often in the kitchen, from whatever was left over. Different dishes sometimes. A different time. The family sat at the table she had set. She stood or sat at the kitchen counter after they finished, or ate before they came down. Researchers who documented the era noted what was sometimes called pan-toting, workers taking home leftover food or cast-off clothing as a form of supplemental compensation because wages were too low and because it was a way of claiming something back. Employers sometimes allowed it, sometimes didn't, sometimes used it as a substitute for paying more. The arrangement was described in oral histories as wages so low they would shock their grandchildren. She cooked the food. The hospitality belonged to someone else. Number 7. The children she raised for someone else. She dressed them, fed them, walked them to school, combed their hair, held the small hand at every street crossing. Full childcare duties were folded into the same daily rate as cleaning, cooking, and laundry. There was no separate line in the pay for raising someone else's children. And while she was doing it, her own children were at home, with a relative, with an older sibling, or in school, in her absence. The intimacy required to care for a child, the patience, the attention, the daily physical presence, coexisted with a back door, a separate bathroom, a first name only, and a wage that had no legal floor. White employers who called their domestic workers part of the family paid wages that could not cover childcare for the worker's own family. The warmth and the terms existed in the same kitchen, on the same morning, without ever reconciling. Number 6. The pay that left no record. At the end of the day, she was handed cash. No envelope, no stub, no record of the hours or the agreed rate. In Atlanta, in 1960, domestic workers earned between $3.50 and $5 per day, for shifts that frequently ran 13 hours. That figure comes from the archive of Dorothy Bolden, who later founded the National Domestic Workers Union of America and spent years fighting to change it. There was no federal minimum wage protecting her work. Prior to 1974, the Fair Labor Standards Act's wage and overtime protections did not apply to domestic workers in private homes. In New York State, in the 1950s, workers weren't covered by minimum wage or minimum hour laws at all unless they worked for the same employer at least 2 days a week. No sick pay, no overtime, no paper trail if the employer decided to pay less. The work was documented in every clean floor and pressed shirt. The wage was not. Until now, the rules lived in her apron strings, the back door latch, the kitchen counter, and the name nobody ever gave her. The next rules are different. They lived in federal documents, statutes, agencies, and legal categories, and they were not informal. They were the building, not the furniture. Number 5. The hiring corner. In New York City, before dawn, Black women gathered on specific street corners in the Bronx and Brooklyn, 170th Street and Jerome Avenue, corners in Brighton Beach and Brownsville waiting to be hired for the day. The journalist Marvel Cook documented it firsthand for the Daily Compass in January 1950, undercover, standing among the women she described as the paper bag brigade. Their work shoes and aprons were in the bags. They waited in cold or rain or heat by the hour to be selected. Employers had been documented turning back clocks, charging for thin lunches, sending women home early with partial pay. There was no standard rate. There was no contract. The woman who waited the longest and accepted the least got the work. The corner was not a system that had failed. It was the system working as designed. Number 4. The laws that left her out. In 1935, when Congress passed the Social Security Act, domestic workers were excluded. In 1938, when Congress passed the Fair Labor Standards Act and established the first federal minimum wage, domestic workers were excluded again. The NAACP testified against both exclusions at the time. Charles Hamilton Houston told Congress that the bills would leave roughly 65% of black workers nationally without coverage. He called the Social Security Act a sieve with holes just big enough for the majority of black workers to fall through. The exclusions passed anyway. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 did not extend workplace discrimination protections to domestic workers. Full federal minimum wage and overtime coverage for household workers did not arrive until 1974, 39 years after the NAACP stood in a congressional chamber and named the problem exactly. The law was not silent. It was specific. The holes were the legislation. Number 3. The reference she couldn't read. Her next job would come through the woman she already worked for. A phone call between two women in the same neighborhood, a name passed across a fence or at a church social, just a first name, and a verdict. In New York, fee-based employment agencies were documented as favoring white women for better quality placements. Black women newly arrived from the South, or without the right connections, found the agencies largely closed to them. The street corner existed partly because the official system was not neutral. In the South, a worker's reputation circulated entirely through employer networks she could not access. She did not know what was being said. She could not correct it. A bad reference, or the absence of one, could close every door in a neighborhood. The official system existed. It was not built for her. Number 2, the room that was not hers. Some women did not go home at the end of the day. They lived in a small room, sometimes above a garage, sometimes in a basement, sometimes a converted closet, was counted as part of their compensation, often in lieu of cash wages. Estimates from the mid-1950s suggest the live-in arrangement remained in place in roughly 200,000 households. For those women, the employer controlled the job, the hours, the housing, and the meals simultaneously. No overtime law applied. No safety standards applied. Asking for a day off, refusing an extra task, or naming how many hours had actually been worked could end the arrangement entirely job and home on the same day. The room looked like stability. A narrow bed, a window over someone else's yard, the the sound of the family below. It was the employer's leverage made into four walls. Number 1. The work that didn't count as work. Here is the keystone. As late as 1940, domestic service was the single largest category of women's paid labor in the United States. 60% of all employed black women in this country identified as domestic servants. It was the primary occupation, and it was excluded, deliberately and repeatedly, from almost every legal protection passed in the 20th century. The reason given, formally and informally, was that household labor resembled what women naturally did at home. It was treated as a labor of love rather than labor, a category of work rather than work itself. Dorothy Bolden, who spent decades inside the occupation and later organized over 10,000 workers in Atlanta alone, put it simply. She said a domestic worker is a counselor, a doctor, a nurse. She said she cares about the family she works for as she cares about her own. She said this in a newspaper supplement while fighting, in the late 1960s, to have domestic workers recognized as workers at all. The NAACP had made the same argument in 1935, in a congressional chamber, with documentation. Nobody rewrote the law for 39 years. The back door, the first name, the separate plate, the hiring corner, the live-in room, the wage with no floor, all of it was possible because of this. A legal decision that the work was not quite work, that the labor was real, but the worker did not need the same protections as workers. The unwritten rules were powerful, but the written ones made space for them. Think about that paper bag beside Loretta's back door. At the start, it looked like a lunch bag. It held her street shoes, the ones she didn't wear through the front door, the ones she changed out of before the family woke up. The rules that put that bag there were mostly never written down. That was the point. You cannot challenge a rule that was never stated. If someone in your family carried a bag like that, or lived inside a rule no one ever named, leave their story below. Subscribe, and come with us to the next one.